Dried bundles of wormwood and yarrow hang on a hook by the door. Next to them are rope measures, and on the table is a clay bowl with warm water and a linen bandage rolled into a ring. The cold creeps into the house when a sealed envelope is brought from the parish. The bishop's office confirms the summons to the ecclesiastical court on hearsay. The everyday things of an adult midwife are suddenly overgrown with suspicion. Herbs are called witchcraft, measuring tapes are called indecent, and the habit of boiling water is called a ritual. Thus, the craft learned from mothers and aunts is turned into evidence. And the more voices there are around about miracles and disasters, the easier it is to turn a household kit into a terrifying altar. Hello, viewers, and welcome back. Write where you are watching from, and leave a comment about which stories about the everyday rules and bodily practices of the past interest you the most. Enjoy listening. What follows is not fiction. In cities and villages, adult women who know midwifery techniques live at the intersection of care and risk. Their tools are simple: warm water, clean linen, oil, herbs for rubbing, rope measures for assessing circumference, knowledge of the position of the pelvis, and the ability to call neighbors for help. Their payment is small change, bread, cloth, sometimes a promise to pay after the rent is collected. And this is where the first crack appears. Money and reputation go hand in hand in a close-knit community. If a client is dissatisfied, if relatives quarrel over payment, if neighbors suffer a loss, blame and resentment quickly find a name. Then the mechanism of public rumor kicks in. It is enough for a church judge to open a case and summon someone for clarification. The offices like order. There are no songs about witches there. There is a formula. A summons by rumor is entered dryly. Who reported it? Who can confirm it? Who was present? Witnesses are asked to appear on a certain day. Adults who are trustworthy are required. At the same time, the subject matter of the case sounds mundane. A dispute over the amount of payment, a misunderstanding with a gift, a claim for the appropriation of a herbal infusion for which another midwife had already been paid, a complaint from a barber surgeon who believes that his clients are being taken away from him. Thus, craft competition spills over into morality. Priests from the pulpit denounce secret practices, while merchants from the market add their arithmetic. If midwives are declared unclean, part of the family's expenses will go to official doctors and herbalists, whose services are more expensive and whose ties to the city are stronger. The first prepared twist here is simple. At the heart of witchcraft lies not miracles, but the economics of demand. Court records are able to record the physical without sensationalism. There are no pictures, there are testimonies. Adult neighbors talk about the oil they rubbed on their stomachs, about the warm infusion they drank from clay cups, about how the midwife sat the women on benches so that someone could pass them flax and water, about how she asked to open the window so that the smoke would not suffocate them. In a normal year, all this would be considered care. But in a year of plague, famine, or crop failure, every step is explained differently. If there are many diseases in the village, the wrong grass is to blame. If the number of serious cases in the city has increased, it is the fault of the wrong woman. And the second twist is already gaining momentum. The weaker the sanitary conditions, the stronger the desire to find someone to blame, and the easier it is to shift the responsibility to a craft that is visible to everyone and not protected by a guild. While seals are being carefully dried in the halls of government offices, leaflets are circulating in the markets, late pamphlets in which women's knowledge is deliberately sexualized and demonized. The authors of these papers know how to gather a crowd. Heated words, a pinch of evidence without verifiable names, hints of secret relations with demons, behind which lies the fear that women know how to manage their bodies and homes without the permission of others. The leaflet does not live long, but it strikes in 3 places at once: income, clients will be frightened away; dignity, relatives will demand purification; and rights, it is easier for a judge to open a case when the city is buzzing. The third twist is brewing quietly. The paper sensation is putting pressure on the paper court, and both are feeding off the same pot of anxiety. A conflict between practice and preaching arises within the case. Practice says that adults need access to hygiene, warm water, clean linen, and an experienced hand that can assess risk. Preaching demands that modesty be shielded from prying eyes, that intervention be limited, and that sanitary measures be replaced by prayerful discipline. When preaching takes the place of housekeeping, trauma and complications increase. But the blame lies not with the doctrine, but with those who were there when things went wrong. And there are already competitors waiting. Barber surgeons and herbalists with no obstetric experience are ready to take their place if the midwife is sent away to repent. All the characters here are adults, and the cruelty is institutional, depriving them of their livelihood, forcing them out of their profession, forcing them to publicly accept the stigma through bans and fines. This is not spectacular punishment, but everyday pressure that makes fingers cold and baskets empty. The archive also shows the opposite trend: attempts by the midwives themselves to level the playing field. In some parishes, adult women were forced to take an oath of sobriety and honesty. Their guarantors' names were recorded, and lists of permitted herbs were approved. Midwives were taught to show the court a clean basket: flax, water, oil, a measuring cup, scissors, thread, no secret powders or devilish signs. Where such practices were codified in writing, the number of cases based on hearsay fell. The paper, on which the set of items and rules was recorded, acted as a shield. But the shield cracks when a new wave of pamphlets and sermons descends on the city. Then it is no longer things that are dragged to court, but images. And here, the difference between myth and document becomes critically important. The document will tell about payment and security measures. The myth, about temptation and secret oaths. And the crowd will choose the myth if it is fed with fear. Fear is especially strong in times of transition, when the authorities are reforming ecclesiastical courts and the city is overhauling healthcare. Then, any profession without privileges is an easy target. The cases feature adult women with IOUs for small amounts. So much for help, so much for flax and oil, so much for staying overnight with a client. These records are more important than hundreds of rumors. They show that knowledge is work with payment and expenses, not secret power. But the courts, feeling the pressure, begin to ask questions about the chants, the gestures, why the window was not opened immediately, and why the water was warm and not cold. Everything that was a sign of neatness yesterday becomes a suspicion tomorrow. This is the grim reality. The economic activities of adults are read as signs if politics requires a sacrifice. By the end of the first part, the main point is clear. Everyday midwifery has been turned into a threat because it is easier to control fear and money that way. Competition and sermons have become overgrown with procedure. The procedure has been stamped, and the stamp has given the market a new language of pressure. Next, we will see how outbreaks of late hunts were fueled by pamphlets, how the profession tried to establish itself through oaths and lists of instruments, and how the archive teaches us to distinguish doctrine, with its ideas of modesty and order, from panic, which loves blood on the ears, but fears accounting and inventory. This will not be a fairy tale about a witch, but an anatomy of craft and power over the body, where the knowledge of adults is turned into guilt, simply because it is accessible without intermediaries. In the affairs of one parish, there is a brief mention of a night call. An adult midwife was called to a woman with prolonged contractions. The road was covered with ice. The assistants could not find a sleigh. They got there on foot, and the water for washing took too long to heat up because of the weak stove. The child in our story is not described because the story is about adults, but the outcome for the household is difficult: fatigue, tears, and broken agreements with workers. The next morning, a neighbor appears at the gate with a claim for payment and a hint of unfair interference, and by lunchtime, the shopkeeper demands payment for the flax that was given on credit. All this is not yet a court case, but it is already pressure, where knowledge is turned into a pretext for economic blackmail. The office is familiar with such scenarios. When a house is weak, neighbors test the strength of its support circles. The midwife responds with what she knows how to do. She brings written confirmations from witnesses, presents receipts for oil and flax, and lists who was called during the night and who was not. However, an invisible multiplier works against her. Later leaflets and sermons, which have already managed to spread the image of secret female knowledge, where body care is deliberately portrayed as licentiousness. Forms of this image creep into the judge's questions, not about the cleanliness of hands and boiling water, but about gestures, chants, and the arrangement of objects. Thus, sanitary logic gives way to symbolic suspicion, and with each new complaint, the list of questionable signs grows like weeds. In another series of acts, two adult midwives clash, arguing about a client and who is entitled to payment. Ordinary professional rivalry escalates into a battle for reputation. One side spreads rumors of witchcraft through relatives, while the other brings a receipt for a deposit and a list of guarantors to the office. The urban environment does not tolerate a vacuum. The case is quickly surrounded by a flurry of denunciatory notes from people who have nothing to say about medicine, but who have old scores to settle over the rent of a shop or a place in the market. The judge is forced to summon everyone and listen to the chorus. At this point, it becomes clear that the fate of the profession is determined not so much by knowledge as by the structure of one's voice. Who has access to the chair? Who to the merchant's table? Who to the copyist in the house at the gate? The twist is that it is not only church ideology that pushes the case towards severity. The city administration also pushes it, as it is profitable for them to concentrate payments on reliable specialists who are easier to keep track of and from whom it is easier to collect taxes. An independent midwife, with her set of flax and herbs, is a figure that does not appear in the known books. Her fault is that she is uncontrollable. The offices respond with procedure. In some dioceses, they introduce oaths for adult midwives, requiring them to appear at the altar and confirm that they do not use forbidden words and means. The lists of permitted items look like the meager inventory of a poor household: flax, oil, water, scissors, thread, a clean shirt, a warm stove. A separate line requires them to call neighbors and adult relatives so that no action takes place without witnesses. Where these requirements have been put in writing, the number of cases unfolding temporarily drops. The document works as a shield because the court has a formalized standard. But the shield cracks when a new wave of anxiety hits the city. Crop failure, plague, severe colds. People want a simple explanation for complex pain, and the old pattern revives. Craftsmanship becomes a scapegoat. At this time, the shelves of city shops are filled with leaflets where women's knowledge is depicted with seductive intonations and hints calculated for the crowd. This is no longer theology or law. It is a black market of fear that feeds the bishop's office with alarm signals. Another case drags on across several parishes. An adult midwife is accused of giving another woman a set of herbs and a rope measure for money, allegedly to hide sin. There is not a single fact about the transaction in the case, only a rumor about a conversation through third parties and a list of possible herbs. The judge examines the basket of items in detail: oil, flax, water, scissors, thread, wormwood, yarrow. Nothing exotic, all familiar to any household. But an anonymous note is attached to the case file, where the same list is accompanied by hints of secret practices. In the box with seals, where inheritance and rent were discussed thousands of times, now they discuss the delusional symbolism of simple things. There is only one antidote: the accounting of the craft. Who made the deposit? Who confirmed the call? Who received payment? And on what day? And again, the document refutes the myth, but only where the midwife had enough strength and connections to gather the papers and guarantors. Sometimes strength runs out. In cases, there are adult women who, after several hearings, abandon their craft and go into laundry or kitchen service. Their knowledge goes with them, not because it is dangerous, but because it is not protected by the guild and the charisma of the department. In the marketplace, this phenomenon is turned into yet another legend about the purification of morals. And in the parish inventory, there remains a pause: who will travel through the snow at night, who has a supply of flax and oil, who knows how to extinguish fever and how to treat hands. The paradox is that the same people who drove the craft with a Shugan wind then complain about the increase in dangerous cases and call a surgeon barber from the city, who asks for more money and does not always know how to do what a neighbor who has passed dozens of houses does. These expenses will not be included in the sheets because the sheet loves myth and does not like counting. In some places, the city authorities are trying a compromise. They offer a register of midwives, a mandatory oath, and the right to work only under the guarantee of 2 or 3 adult matrons. In exchange, they promise protection from arbitrary accusations and public purges in the square. Where this has been successfully recorded and enforced, conflicts do not disappear, but they become shorter and less costly. Midwives are taught to show clean hands, boil water in the presence of witnesses, store herbs in signed bags, and keep a small notebook of expenses. This is still vulnerable to waves of panic, but at least there is something to put on the table in court besides the clamor of voices. Years later, the archives will reveal a simple fact: where registers, oaths, and lists of items worked at a minimum, there were fewer leaflets, and where the city played to the gallery and fueled the sermon, there were more leaflets, and they became more expensive for everyone. The darkest part is the end of the hunting season, when fear and propaganda lead to harsher measures. There will be no public hangings or bonfires here. This is not that genre or that geography, but there will be bans on the profession, denial of income, expulsion, fines, and stigmas in inventories. Adults who have been deprived of their craft become poorer, and the city becomes more dangerous. The decline in sanitary skills does not elicit applause, but it does add to the queues at the hospital and the bitter smell of vinegar in homes. The arsenal of survival, linen, water, oil, clean hands, knowledge of the position of the pelvis, remains the same. Only access to it is made to look like alienation. Bodies still require warmth and care, but the authorities, who have chosen panic, replace this truth with pretty leaflets. At the end of this part, it becomes clear how the archive teaches us to read, to separate doctrine, where there is an attempt to regulate order and modesty, from panic, where craft is turned into guilt in order to gain power. Next, we will have to figure out how exactly the myth reaches into the pocket of the house, why preaching is so easily associated with denunciation, and what adults in the community can do to restore knowledge to the form of a contract rather than a stigma. In one notebook with parish expenses, a strange pattern can be seen. Next to the lines about candles and roof repairs, there are contributions for the reliability of midwives, as if trust can be bought with coins and seals. The city explains this as a matter of order. Adult women are offered the opportunity to pay a deposit and receive a permit, promising protection from arbitrariness in return. In reality, the deposit becomes a tool of selection. Those who are poorer are more vulnerable, and those who cannot pay the amount on time risk losing their earnings for the entire season. This gap allows for a new form of pressure. It is easier for registered workers to accuse unregistered ones, and it is more difficult for unregistered workers to defend themselves because their basket of goods without a stamp is seen by the court as a sign of secrecy. The situation is exacerbated by a divergence of disciplines. The ecclesiastical court watches over modesty and forms. The city official watches over rent and taxes, and real hygiene remains between them. Where the stove weakens in winter and cold water takes a long time to boil, registration and preaching do not help. But that is where the next rumor comes in, because trouble loves a simple explanation: to accuse those who were closest to the body and the risk. Thus, the myth is fueled by poverty. In rare records, there are attempts to turn the field towards education. Several cities are trying to gather adult midwives for short lessons in order, to show how to boil water without wasting firewood, how to keep a list of expenses, how to store herbs in labeled bags, and who should see the basket before starting work. They also discuss which gestures and words the crowd misinterprets and how to protect oneself from suspicion. Keep witnesses in sight, make notes about arrival and departure times, call neighbors so that every procedure has an adult observer. These practices are boring and lack glamour, but they reduce the scope for denunciation. However, they are consumed by paper noise. Pamphlets are impoverished by facts, but rich in images, and images are always faster than procedures. When new leaflets appear in the city with the latest story about destructive knowledge, those who fear for their reputation stop attending classes, and even admission no longer saves them. Admission is seen as a privilege and a cause for envy. The prepared shift is reflected in the attendance figures. The louder the market, the lower the turnout for classes, and the more often the court asks for public satisfaction of the crowd, although there is not a single line about such a remedy in the books. Somewhere on the coast, a stubborn cleric writes a dry formula in the parish book. Adult midwives must keep their hands clean, have separate dishes for water, show scissors and thread before starting work, and keep a rope measure in front of witnesses. He does not make theology out of this. He makes a checklist out of it. Nearby, in the accountant's notebook, are noted the expenses of the houses for flax, vinegar, firewood, and oil. Precisely those items that the accusers would later call suspicious. Comparing these two columns has a chilling effect on the archivist reading the page centuries later. The things that save and the things that accuse coincide line by line. This means that the weapon is not in the item itself, but in its interpretation, and interpretation is driven by profit. Here, another twist emerges. Knowledge is blamed not where it is harmful, but where it is uncontrollable and economically unaccounted for. An adult who knows how to help without an intermediary irritates the accounting system. Sometimes a foreign hand shines through in business. Competitors in treatment who are cramped in the market. Barber surgeons offer the city a continuous licensed network of care and promise accountability. But they do not always possess the midwifery skills that were passed down from older to younger generations in homes. Their complaints about wild practices are fueled by the same fears as preaching. Mixed rhetoric about looseness and disorder gathers signatures faster than explanations about boiling water and clean hands. Clergymen respond by tightening oaths. Officials add fees, and in homes, the same clay bowls and pieces of linen remain on the tables, and the same night roads on ice remain. Adult craftswomen are forced to live as if on the border. Every gesture must be preceded by a witness, every expense recorded on a piece of paper, every night ready for inspection. Thus is born a tedious, exhausting discipline of survival, not about miracles, but about lists, keys, and seals. Knowledge is hidden away in the accounting department, because only there does it cease to be seen as witchcraft. Towards the end of the hunting cycle, when the city is fed up with rumors, fatigue sets in. Some cases are closed due to lack of evidence, some are extinguished by internal settlements, and in some parishes, reconciliation is initiated. An adult midwife is granted the right to work with 2 guarantors and access to a hospital stove to heat water without paying for firewood, in exchange for which she undertakes to show a basket of items and keep records. It is an ugly but workable compromise. It does not extinguish envy or shut down the leaf markets, but it does restore the craft's appearance of legitimacy. As a result, the price of denunciation falls. To stir up a new scandal, it is no longer enough to whisper about herbs. One must show a violation of the established order. This does not make the crowd any kinder, but it does make it more expensive for them to play panic, and in this expense lies the first real relief. The archive, which does not care about the taste of leaflets, will leave us with what really stands the test of time. Lists of guarantors, pledges, oaths, lists of items, winter heating schedules, and records of flax expenses. It will show how everyday midwifery was turned into a threat, and how this threat was tied to money, access, and rights. It will remind us that stories about witches were fed by 2 kitchens at once, the kitchen of fear and the kitchen of competition. And if you read carefully, you will see the last and most important thing. Power over the body is not a slogan of later eras, but an old, difficult economic issue that was attempted to be resolved by courts, seals, and leaflets. Where lists and demands for clean hands prevailed, survival was more important than myth. Where leaflets and sermons prevailed, the knowledge of adults was turned into guilt, while flax supplies dwindled in homes and stoves went cold. All that remains is to sum up and call the outcome human decisions, not pictures from the market, because it is not legends that save, but boring rules preserved by the hand of the copyist. The last thing recorded on the parchment is the city's weariness, with its own horror stories and the slow rebuilding of the adult world. Where yesterday they were chasing images, today they are returning to things: stoves, water, flax, keys, and accounting. The parish notebook receives a simple addition. Next to the expenses for candles and the roof, there is a line about the right of midwives to heat water at the hospital stove without paying for firewood at night. Next to it are the names of adult guarantors who undertake to be witnesses in cases of risk. Below is a list of items allowed for work, with notes on who checked the basket and when. This is not theology or poetry, it is the language of survival. There is nothing to show the crowd, but it can be used to close a case on hearsay when it is not fear that comes to court, but a list. In those parishes where such boring measures are set down in writing, the most precious things are saved: the peace and quiet of homes and the health of adults. There, the market for anonymous leaflets empties faster. When there is a record on the table, it is more difficult for a pamphlet to pretend to be a document. And here, the final fork in the road becomes clear. Either the city pays hard cash for panic, or a dry formula for order. But the archive does not romanticize victory. It honestly shows the price. Adult midwives have to work under suspicion. Every manipulation is witnessed. Every expense is marked. Every call is recorded with the time. This is exhausting and squeezes out the weak. Some of the craft goes into other occupations: cooking, laundry, the market, and the skills are lost along with them. Some remain, reinforced by official armor, oaths, guarantees, access to hospital stoves, the right to store herbs in signed bags, the obligation to show a basket of items annually. The city takes knowledge hostage in the form of accounting, and this is better than the square, but worse than free craftsmanship. In the final balance, losses still appear. Where the leaf reigns for the season, the inventories show more expenses for vinegar and flax, and more sad notes about nights when it was harder to get to boiling water than to hearing. The combination of doctrine and panic in these matters can be read like layers on a wall. Doctrine attempts to define propriety and the limits of participation, touching on the delicate matters of shame and distance. Panic, unable to count, craves spectacle and replaces talk of hygiene with words about uncleanliness and secrecy. Competition on this ground flourishes more viciously than the sermon itself. Barbers and city doctors argue over payment and access to the home. Shopkeepers argue over the creditworthiness of the family. Officials argue over fees and reporting. Where each of these desires gets a piece of paper, the everyday craft of adults is turned into a symbol. But symbols don't heal. Hands washed in warm water and linen tested in front of witnesses heal. The archive, tired and indifferent to the gestures of the crowd, remembers precisely this, and when, years later, people reread the lines about flax, oil, and keys on a hook, it becomes clear. The fault here was not in knowledge, but in the fact that knowledge could be applied without an intermediary, without paying extra taxes, and without obeying someone else's authority. Pamphlets do not disappear because of this. They simply change their angle, from witchcraft to morality, from licentiousness to rebellion. But where the court and the administration uphold procedure, their life is short. A summons, on hearsay, without evidence, names, or deadlines, often ends with a dry note of termination, and at that moment it becomes clear how important it is for the profession to have a minimum of institutional support. Where there is none, the myth returns along with hunger and colds. Where it does exist, the myth has to cost more, and it goes looking for another soft target. The adults who remain in the trade do not write treatises. They repair stoves, dry flax, argue over the right to have the key to the hospital door, and stand guard on frosty roads where a heavy basket seems lighter than a paper quart, because that quart is frozen and alien. They learn to live with the gaze of witnesses and with inventory reduced to the obvious, and in this there is a bitter dignity, to hold on to life without turning it into a spectacle. The last page of this story is not about retribution or miracles. It is about the gap between myth and paper, and about human choice in favor of boring order. At the center is not magic, but power over the body, which they try to take away with fear and return with a receipt. And so the ending sounds hollow, like footsteps in the stone corridor of an office. Adults are given back the right to practice their craft, but within the narrow confines of a list. The city retains the seal and the key. The sermon with the leaflet retreats not out of conviction, but out of weariness with the process. This is not a victory of light, but the stability of home. A home where dried bundles of herbs hang on hooks, rope measures lie nearby, and a bowl of warm water sits on the table, where knowledge ceased to be called witchcraft when its value and labor were recognized, where intimacy is not a sensation for the market, but an item in the expense book. And if anything in this darkness really resembles salvation, it is the adults who have decided to live by the book, not by the leaf, and the city that has agreed to count, not to burn. And yet, the myth casts a long shadow, which returns home with every crop failure, every prolonged frost, every rumor of trouble in the neighboring parish. At this moment, it is not the loudness of the leaf that matters, but how tightly knowledge has been tied to procedure in recent years. Where adult midwives have achieved a simple set of guarantees, an oath, 2 guarantors, access to a hospital stove, a register of items in the basket, the obligation to call on neighbors as witnesses, hearsay cases are already being held up at the office door. It is easier for a judge to put a notebook on the table where night calls and expenses for linen and vinegar are listed, than to rummage through an anonymous piece of paper with tempting hints. Where there is no such notebook, everything starts all over again. Sermons about modesty replace conversations about boiling water and clean hands. Market stalls with cheap pamphlets clatter louder than sand in a sandbox for sprinkling ink, and fear once again finds buyers. In small towns, this pendulum swings more slowly, in port cities more quickly. But everywhere the outcome depends on whether adults are ready to accept the boring world of lists instead of the bright world of symbols. And as soon as this happens, the main fuel is gradually eroded from stories about witches, the profitable confusion between physical care and moral anxiety. Over the past few winters, something has formed that was not there at the beginning. A network of mutual support where adult women do not walk alone. In some parishes, they organize shifts in pairs so that each manipulation has a second pair of hands and a second entry in the notebook. In others, they agree on a common basket of items, kept in a hospital cabinet under 2 keys so that no one can say that someone has special herbs. This is not ideal and does not protect against envy, but it is a framework in which it is easier to sort out tragedies without a circus. When trouble happens, it is not the image that is presented to the court, but the sequence of events. Who called? Who came? How the water was heated? What was shown to the witnesses? How much money was set aside for linen? Who made the deposit and when? At this point, the text pauses and breathes. Instead of witchcraft, there is the heavy but honest accounting of life. Those who wanted blood or spectacle leave the market disappointed. The document cannot entertain, but it can keep the house from falling apart. But experience does not erase trauma. The archive notes the fatigue of adult bodies, whose joints ache from nighttime roads and wet steps, whose palms are roughened by endless flax and boiling water. It records burnout, not with a trendy word, but with the silent line, "stopped working." It preserves the names of those who stayed, agreeing to live under the gaze of witnesses and behind the locked doors of the hospital. Their choice is devoid of romance: to agree to be monitored for the right to approach the body, to endure suspicion for access to the stove, to be able to close the notebook when the market is noisy again. It is a heavy price, but it is less than the one paid where the process was not accepted, where the craft was replaced by leaflets, where cold and dirt returned to the city, and with them, long queues at hospital benches and bitter vinegar in rooms where there was nothing to wash away the smell of fear. So unobtrusively, doctrine, if kept in moderation, turns out to be an ally of order, while panic, even when it bears sacred words, remains a market. Somewhere in the depths of the records, there is a dry entry about how the parish canceled the penalty for indecent measures and introduced the obligation to keep rope ribbons in full view of witnesses. After it, there is another entry stating that any call at night entitles the caller to free boiling water from the hospital stove if the stove at home is cold or the firewood is weak. A little further down is a list of permitted herbs and a note that each bundle must be in a separate bag marked by the inspector. These seem like tiny decisions, but they are what separate myth from paper. Where they work, the universally hated intimate accounting ceases to be a stigma and becomes insurance. Things that yesterday were called a threat are transferred to inventory, accounted for, checked, and cease to be easy prey for leaflets. At this moment, the quietest, almost imperceptible triumph of truth can be heard. Fear, deprived of its symbol, is too expensive to buy, and concern, translated into the language of lists, finally gains the right not to justify itself. The ending of this story does not raise torches or promise idyll. It explains how the everyday knowledge of adults became guilt, and how this guilt was turned into a commodity. It shows that guilt was removed not with words of love or tears of repentance, but with the tedious labor of registers, oaths, and keys. At the center remains power over the body, not mysterious or dirty, but economic and communal, requiring water, heat, and hands. And if there is an outcome that can be called a human decision, it looks like this. The city agrees to count, not to excite. The judge agrees to read, not listen to the market. Adults agree to work under the watchful eye of the audience in order to work at all. Then the bunches of herbs on the hook cease to be a symbol. The rope measures, a temptation, and the bishop's seal, intimidation. All this becomes what it used to be. Things that serve the body and the home. And when, on another winter evening, a bundle is brought from the office, it often contains not a frightening image, but a form. Those very lines behind which lies the difficult but honest victory of paper over panic.